The sea remembers everything, every drop of blood spilled in its depths, every ship claimed by storm, every promise made in desperation as waves rose higher than hope itself. Along the forgotten coast where ancient treaties had once been written in foam and signed with salt, the boundary between two worlds remained as fluid as the tides that marked their eternal dance of approach and retreat, connection and separation, understanding and fear. Iron Hale had spent 43 years learning the sea's moods through careful observation that substituted for formal education about forces beyond human control or comprehension. His small cottage perched on cliffs that had witnessed countless storms, while providing shelter for those wise enough to respect power that could reshape coastlines through patient persistence or violent transformation, depending upon circumstances that mortal understanding could rarely predict accurately. The fishing nets that hung from weathered posts spoke of solitary life chosen through necessity rather than preference, their careful repairs reflecting determination to maintain independence despite isolation that made survival more difficult than community cooperation might have allowed. But community had failed him when grief demanded silence that others could not respect, when loss created needs that sympathy could not address, when healing required solitude that social obligation would not permit. Years spent in communion with tides and weather had taught lessons about rhythm and patience that land-dwelling society rarely understood or valued, despite wisdom such education provided about forces that connected all existence through cycles too vast for individual comprehension, yet intimate enough to affect daily survival through practical knowledge earned by those who listened more than they spoke. The old stories whispered by elderly fishermen in harbors where wine loosened tongues spoke of deeper currents that carried more than fish and seaweed, of ancient agreements between surface dwellers and those who claimed ocean depths as sovereign territory governed by laws that human justice could not encompass or challenge through conventional authority. Such tales served as warnings disguised as entertainment, caution wrapped in fantasy, truth preserved through repetition that kept memory alive when official history preferred comfortable ignorance. But tonight, as storm clouds gathered on horizon that seemed too distant to threaten immediate safety, circumstances would arrange encounter that transformed folklore into living reality, while testing whether compassion could bridge differences that treaties had acknowledged but never truly resolved through mutual understanding based on shared recognition of common vulnerability despite apparent opposition between worlds that served different masters. The mermaid who would wash ashore carried within her failing body secrets that challenged every assumption about relationships between land and sea, surface and depth, human need and oceanic law that governed territories beyond coastal authority, through power that made royal armies seem insignificant compared to forces that commanded tides themselves as willing servants rather than neutral phenom. Anna. Thalassa had spent 17 years learning currents that connected distant realms while preparing for responsibilities that would determine whether ancient hostilities continued serving fear or could evolve into cooperation that honored both sovereignty and mutual dependence through recognition that isolation served neither realm effectively when challenges threatened survival that required wisdom from multiple sources. Her presence on shore would force confrontation between mercy and tradition, individual conscience and collective obligation, personal choice and systemic law that had maintained uneasy peace through centuries of careful separation that might prove inadequate for addressing crises that demanded collaboration, despite cultural differences that seemed insurmountable, through normal diplomatic approach. Hess. The fisherman's choice would echo through depths where warriors prepared responses to violations that could not be ignored, despite intentions that served compassion rather than conquest, kindness rather than challenge to authority that had been earned through strength, but never tested through encounters that required understanding more complex than simple application of established protocols for dealing with surface dwellers. In Cottage, where solitude had been cultivated through painful experience with human nature and its limitations, acts of mercy would be evaluated according to consequences that extended far beyond individual motivation, toward implications for relationships between realms whose cooperation remained essential, despite mutual suspicion that history had justified, through experiences that trust alone, old not overcome without proof that understanding was possible. The night would bring choice between safety that isolation provided and danger that compassion demanded, while dawn would reveal whether kindness could survive contact with laws that had never been designed to accommodate exceptions based on individual character rather than collective identity, that determined friend or foe, according to species rather than spirit. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The storm approached with deliberate malice that veteran fishermen learned to recognize through signs invisible to casual observers. Subtle shifts in wind direction that spoke of pressure building beyond immediate horizon. Changes in wave patterns that suggested forces gathering strength for assault upon coastlines that had endured countless such attacks while occasionally surrendering territory to a power that acknowledged no permanent boundaries. Iran secured his boat with movements that had become automatic through decades of preparation for weather that could transform familiar harbor into deadly trap for those who failed to respect ocean's capacity for sudden violence. The small vessel represented his livelihood and independence, its careful maintenance reflecting understanding that survival depended upon tools that connected him to resources the sea provided for those skilled enough to harvest them, while respecting laws that governed such relationships. "Bad one coming," he muttered to wind that carried salt spray inland with force that made conversation unnecessary since no neighbors remained close enough to hear warnings or offer assistance during emergencies that tested individual preparedness against collective vulnerability. His nearest human contact lived 6 miles along coast, where fishing community maintained social connections that his solitude deliberately avoided, despite practical advantages that cooperation might provide. The cottage windows had been shuttered against wind that would soon test structural integrity that his grandfather's craftsmanship had built to withstand storms that measured destructive power in centuries rather than seasons. Inside, oil lamps provided illumination that electricity could not match for reliability when weather interrupted power systems that coastal authorities maintained with varying degrees of success. "Going to be a long night," he observed while checking supplies that included fresh water, preserved food, medical materials, and repair equipment that storm damage typically required for maintaining habitability in aftermath of natural violence that respected no human claims about property or permanence. But as darkness settled over waters that reflected lightning flashes from clouds still distant enough to provide warning time for final preparations, unusual sound reached him through wind that normally carried only natural voices of storm and sea, combining their ancient chorus of power and persistence. Singing drifted across waves with clarity that defied weather conditions, its melody weaving through storm sounds like thread of pure beauty that challenged harsh symphony of approaching violence. The voice carried notes beyond human range while maintaining emotional resonance that spoke directly to heart, rather than requiring intellectual translation for understanding that transcended language barriers. "What in the depths?" Iron whispered while stepping onto porch that provided elevated view of shoreline where moonlight occasionally penetrated cloud cover to reveal white foam marking boundary between safe harbor and open ocean that served as highway for forces beyond coastal authority or understanding. The singing continued despite storm winds that should have scattered such delicate sound across distances too vast for individual voice to bridge, its persistence suggesting source closer than initial impression had indicated, while beauty implied singer, whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations, despite emotional content that spoke of universal experiences with loss and hope. Following melody that seemed to call specifically to him despite rational recognition that such personal interpretation reflected wishful thinking rather than supernatural communication, Iran made his way down rocky path that connected Clifftop Cottage to shore, where tides deposited offerings that ranged from useful salvage to dangerous debris, depending upon storm's particular moods and oceanic generosity. "Hello?" he called against wind that immediately claimed his words for distribution, across waters where they might reach intended audience or disappear into vastness that made individual communication seem impossibly presumptuous. "Someone there? Need help?" The singing stopped abruptly, creating silence that felt more complete than mere absence of sound should have achieved, given storm noise that continued providing aggressive soundtrack for weather drama approaching its violent crescendo. The sudden quiet carried weight that suggested response to his call, rather than coincidental conclusion to musical expression. "Please," came reply so faint that he wondered whether wind had created illusion of communication through combination of natural sounds that desperate imagination interpreted as human speech. "Help. Please." Following voice toward cluster of rocks that formed natural barrier between sandy beach and deeper water, where fishing became productive, but dangerous for small boats during normal weather conditions, that storm transformed into lethal challenge for any vessel caught beyond protective harbor, Iran discovered source of singing that had drawn him from secure shelter. A figure lay among tide pools that reflected lightning with mirror clarity, her form half concealed by shadows that made immediate identification difficult despite obvious distress, that her position and condition indicated through posture suggesting exhaustion beyond normal human experience with physical limits. "Miss?" he called while approaching carefully to avoid startling someone whose circumstances remained unclear, despite obvious need for assistance that isolation had taught him to provide, without expecting reciprocal support during his own emergencies. "You hurt? Need medical attention?" Moonlight breaking through storm clouds revealed truth that challenged every assumption about reality and folklore, possible and impossible, natural and supernatural, that his coastal upbringing had taught him to distinguish through practical experience rather than theoretical speculation about phenomena beyond normal observation. The woman possessed beauty that transcended human categories while maintaining features recognizable enough to create connection, despite characteristics that marked her as belonging to realm beyond terrestrial authority. Her hair moved with currents that no wind could create, while scales along her arms caught light with iridescence that gems could not match, despite earthly attempts to capture such ethereal radiance. "Mermaid," he whispered with recognition that folklore had prepared him to acknowledge even as rational mind, protested impossibility of encounter, that stories claimed happened rarely enough to remain legendary, rather than historical fact, requiring practical response to immediate crisis. "Please," she repeated with voice that carried ocean depths alongside immediate vulnerability, her golden eyes focusing upon his face with intensity that suggested recognition of significance beyond simple request for emergency assistance. Water, fresh water. The irony of ocean creature requesting liquid that surrounded her in infinite quantities, registered briefly before understanding, penetrated his shock about circumstances that had brought mythical being into range of human assistance during storm that seemed designed to test boundaries between possible and impossible. Salt poisoning. The realization brought practical response to supernatural situation, as coastal knowledge about seawater's toxic effects upon those adapted to different salinity levels provided framework for understanding emergency that required immediate intervention, despite unprecedented nature of patient whose survival depended upon assistance he could provide. "Wait here," he instructed, while turning toward cottage where fresh water supplies could address immediate crisis, despite absurdity of commanding Mermaid, to remain motionless when her natural habitat surrounded current location, with freedom she could claim simply by submitting to waves that would carry her beyond reach of human assistance. "Don't leave," she pleaded with voice that carried fear alongside physical distress, her expression suggesting terror of abandonment, rather than concern about dying alone in an environment that should have supported her existence, but apparently threatened her survival through conditions he could not understand, without knowledge of oceanic physiology and mermaid biology that human education had never included. "Ed, not leaving," he assured while removing shirt that could serve as temporary protection against exposure that was contributing to her deterioration through heat loss that even supernatural constitution could not withstand indefinitely, despite adaptation to aquatic environment. Just getting water, fresh water, help with salt sickness. The garment covered her torso while providing dignity that nudity had compromised, despite circumstances that made modesty seem irrelevant, compared to survival needs that demanded immediate attention to medical emergency, rather than social conventions designed for normal human interaction. "Back in 5 minutes," he promised, while securing covering that would remain in place, despite wind and waves that threatened to sweep away anything not properly anchored against natural forces that respected no human attempt to impose order upon chaotic environment. The climb to cottage required speed, that age and caution normally prevented, but emergency demanded risks that ordinary circumstances would have counseled against, through recognition that his own safety served no purpose, if delay cost life that his assistance might preserve through timely intervention, despite unprecedented nature of situation. Fresh water from well that his grandfather had dug, with understanding that coastal living required independence from sources that storm or drought could compromise filled containers that would provide multiple applications, if initial treatment proved insufficient for addressing poisoning that threatened Mermaid's survival through accumulation of salt beyond her system's capacity for processing. "Still here," he announced while returning to find her exactly where he had left her, though consciousness seemed more fragile than before, suggesting that condition was deteriorating despite temporary stabilization, that his presence had apparently provided through psychological comfort alongside physical protection. "Thank you," she managed while accepting water with gratitude that transcended species barriers through recognition that kindness could bridge differences that seemed insurmountable when reduced to essential human response to suffering, that demanded compassion, regardless of theoretical complications about appropriate behavior toward legendary creatures. The fresh water brought immediate improvement as color returned to features that had been growing pale with progressive system failure, while breathing became more regular through relief from toxic burden that her physiology could not eliminate without assistance that only land dweller could provide during crisis that storm had created through unknown circumstances. "Better?" he asked, while supporting her weight against rocks that provided backrest, while protecting from waves that continued their assault upon shore, with violence that would have swept unsupported figure into depths, where rescue would become impossible, despite supernatural abilities that water should have restored rather than threatening. "Better," she confirmed with voice that carried strength, returning through treatment that addressed immediate crisis, while creating opportunity for conversation that would reveal truth about encounter, that challenged everything he understood about relationships between human and oceanic worlds. "Name's Iran," he offered with introduction that seemed appropriate, despite extraordinary circumstances that made normal social interaction feel inadequate for communication between species that had maintained separation through centuries of mutual avoidance and systematic ignorance about each other's nature. "Thalassa," she replied with name that carried ocean music within its syllables, while her golden eyes met his with recognition that their encounter transcended random chance, to serve purposes neither fully understood, despite instinctive awareness that connection had been established through circumstances that required courage from both participants. As storm continued its assault upon coastline where they sheltered together, human and mermaid, surface dweller and ocean child, conversation began that would reveal truths about both worlds while testing whether compassion could overcome ancient fears that had kept their peoples apart through isolation that served safety rather than understanding. The storm passed with reluctant surrender that left behind crystalline dawn, where every surface gleamed with residual moisture that caught morning light like scattered diamonds across landscape, transformed by night's violence into clean slate, where new possibilities could be written. The sea, exhausted by its own fury, retreated to gentle lapping that seemed almost apologetic after hours of determined assault upon shore that had withstood countless such attacks through geological patience. Aaron woke to silence that felt strange after storm's constant noise, his body stiff from sleeping propped against rocks while maintaining vigil over Thalassa, whose condition had stabilized through night of careful water administration and protective presence that created sanctuary where two worlds could meet without ancient hostilities, interfering with immediate human need for connection. "Morning," he said softly, while observing her peaceful sleep that suggested healing had progressed beyond immediate crisis toward genuine recovery that would soon restore strength necessary for return to oceanic home where she belonged, despite connection that night's shared experience had created between them. "Morning," she replied, with voice that carried ocean depths alongside renewed vitality, her golden eyes opening to focus upon his face with recognition that their encounter had evolved beyond emergency assistance toward relationship that neither had expected when circumstances first brought them together through storm and suffering. "Feeling stronger?" he asked with concern that encompassed both medical assessment and genuine care for welfare that had become personal rather than merely humanitarian obligation to help creature in distress, regardless of species barriers that normally prevented such intimate cooperation. "Much stronger," Thalassa confirmed, while attempting to shift position that would allow more comfortable conversation, though movement revealed limitations that salt poisoning had imposed, despite overnight improvement through fresh water treatment that had addressed immediate toxicity without completely restoring normal function. "Easy," Aaron cautioned, while providing support that prevented strain which could trigger relapse, despite apparent progress toward full recovery that required patience, rather than optimistic assumptions about healing rates that supernatural constitution might permit through capabilities beyond human medical understanding. "The tide is returning," she observed with attention toward waterline that had crept closer during their conversation, bringing with it possibility of escape that would end encounter while restoring her to element where true healing could occur through connection to source that sustained her existence beyond temporary land-based interventions. "Yes," he agreed with recognition that rising tide would soon provide opportunity for departure, that circumstances had delayed through crisis requiring his assistance, but which natural rhythm would resolve through oceanic processes that needed no human participation or ongoing support. "I should return before." She began with obvious reluctance that suggested internal conflict between duty, requiring departure, and desire for continued connection that night's shared experience had created through understanding that transcended species differences despite brief duration of their acquaintance. "Before what?" Erin asked with curiosity about obligations that made immediate departure necessary, despite apparent safety that dawn had restored to coastal environment, where storm's passage had eliminated immediate threats to survival or discovery by authorities who might complicate her situation. "Before they come looking," Thalassa explained with expression that carried concern extending beyond personal welfare, toward implications that her absence would create for others, whose responsibility included ensuring her safety through protective measures that her unauthorized surface visit had circumvented. "They?" He pressed with growing awareness that her presence on shore represented more than individual accident or personal choice, suggesting larger context that involved other members of her kind, whose concern for her welfare might motivate responses that could affect his own safety if her rescue was interpreted as hostile action, rather than humanitarian assistance. "My people," she clarified, with tone that balanced affection for community that cared about her welfare, with recognition that protective concern could manifest through actions that seemed threatening to surface dwellers, whose involvement in oceanic affairs typically received hostile rather than grateful response from guardians responsible for maintaining boundaries. "Will they be upset?" "About surface contact?" Erin asked, with careful phrasing that acknowledged potential diplomatic complications while avoiding assumptions about hostile intentions that might not accurately reflect oceanic perspective on emergency assistance that had saved life, rather than threatening security. "Not upset, exactly," Thalassa replied with hesitation, that suggested complexity in oceanic law regarding surface interaction, that simple categories of permission or prohibition could not adequately address, given circumstances that ancient treaties had not anticipated, despite comprehensive attempts to regulate contact between realms. But concerned about treaty violations that unauthorized surface visits represent regardless of circumstances that motivated such contact or outcomes that resulted from interaction with surface dwellers, whose intentions remained unknown until demonstrated through actions that could be evaluated according to established criteria. "Treaties?" Iran repeated with recognition that formal agreements existed between surface and oceanic authorities, despite his ignorance about specific terms or historical context that had motivated such diplomatic arrangements for managing relationship between realms, whose differences seemed too great for successful negotiation. "Ancient agreements that maintain peace through separation," Thalassa explained with educational tone, that suggested importance of understanding framework that governed interaction between their peoples, despite personal connection that had developed through shared experience, transcending political considerations. Agreements that recognize surface authority over land territories, while acknowledging oceanic sovereignty over depths, with coastal areas serving as neutral zones where emergency assistance remains permissible, provided such contact serves immediate humanitarian need rather than ongoing relationship that could compromise security arrangements. "And last night qualified as emergency assistance?" He asked with hope that their encounter would receive interpretation that protected both participants from consequences that treaty violations might impose through punishment designed to discourage unauthorized contact, regardless of motivations that inspired such interaction. "Yes," she confirmed with relief, that suggested her own concern about potential complications, despite recognition that circumstances clearly justified his assistance, under terms that emergency provisions allowed for preserving life, without violating spirit of agreements that served mutual security, rather than preventing all cooperation between realms. Though duration of contact and level of care provided might require explanation to authorities whose responsibility includes evaluating such incidents to ensure that emergency provisions are not being exploited for unauthorized purposes that could threaten established boundaries. As morning light strengthened across waters that reflected sky with mirror clarity, while gentle waves began their ancient rhythm of approach and retreat that would soon provide vehicle for her departure, conversation turned toward practical concerns about managing return that would minimize complications for both participants, while preserving positive interpretation of encounter that had created. Connection neither wanted to sever completely. "Will you be safe?" Aaron asked, with genuine concern that transcended species differences to embrace simple human worry about welfare of someone whose company had enriched his existence despite brief duration of their acquaintance and inevitable nature of separation that oceanic obligations demanded. "Safe from physical harm," Thalassa assured, while her expression suggested other forms of danger that evaluation of her surface contact might create through political consequences, rather than personal punishment for behavior that fell within technical limits of emergency assistance, while possibly exceeding boundaries of appropriate interaction. But there may be discussion about circumstances that led to salt poisoning that required surface assistance, and whether such incidents could have been prevented through more careful attention to oceanic safety protocols that exist specifically to avoid situations requiring contact with surface dwellers. And will such discussion affect your position or standing within your community? He pressed with awareness that consequences extending beyond immediate participants could result from emergency assistance that had seemed straightforward when focused solely on preserving life, rather than considering political implications. Unknown, she admitted with honesty that acknowledged complexity of oceanic politics, that individual merit could not always overcome when collective security concerns demanded investigation of incidents that challenged established patterns of behavior designed to maintain protective separation. Though your kindness and respect during emergency will be noted in any evaluation of circumstances that brought us together, and should influence interpretation of events toward recognition of positive outcomes, despite technical violations of contact protocols. The rising tide had advanced sufficiently to permit departure, while conversation revealed depths of connection that both treasured despite inevitable separation, that duty demanded through obligations neither could abandon for personal preference, however strong attraction had become through night of shared vulnerability and mutual care. "I must go," Thalassa said with obvious reluctance while accepting his assistance for movement toward water that would restore her to natural element, where healing could complete through processes that land-based treatment had initiated but could not finish without oceanic resources. "I know," Iren agreed with equal reluctance while supporting her progress toward waves that lapped against shore with gentle invitation, contrasting sharply with previous night's violent assault upon coastline, where storm had created crisis that brought them together through circumstances that seemed designed to test possibilities for understanding between realms. "Thank you," she said while pausing at water's edge where foam created boundary between worlds, that their encounter had temporarily bridged through compassion, that challenged ancient assumptions about necessary separation, designed to protect both communities from dangers that fear had magnified beyond realistic threat assessment. "Thank you for trusting me," he replied, with recognition that her acceptance of assistance had required courage, equal to his decision to provide help, despite warnings about oceanic contact that folklore had embedded in coastal culture, through stories designed to discourage exactly such interaction, regardless of humanitarian motivations. "Perhaps," she began with voice that carried hope alongside uncertainty about possibilities for future connection, despite obligations that currently prevented open relationship between surface dweller and ocean child, whose responsibilities to respective communities might require continued separation. "Perhaps if circumstances permit," she concluded with meaningful glance that suggested understanding had developed between them, that could survive temporary separation, while remaining available for renewal, if diplomatic evolution permitted more open communication between realms whose mutual isolation had served protection at cost of enriching cooperation. As waves embraced her returning form with joy that spoke of homecoming, while his heart registered loss of connection that had transformed solitary existence into shared experience, Aaron watched until distance claimed her figure from view, while understanding remained vivid in memory that would preserve significance of encounter, regardless of whether reunion would prove possible. But as morning advanced toward afternoon with peaceful rhythm that suggested normal resumption of coastal routine, disturbance on horizon began gathering that would transform understanding of consequences from simple departure toward recognition that oceanic response to surface contact involved forces whose attention could reshape everything he understood about safety, isolation, and the price of compassion when offered across boundaries that ancient laws had established for reasons that individual kindness could not override, despite purity of motivations. The sea was returning more than Thalassa to depths where her people waited with questions about unauthorized surface contact that emergency provisions might justify, but could not excuse without evaluation, that would determine whether treaty boundaries required reinforcement through demonstration of oceanic power that surface dwellers had forgotten or chosen to ignore, despite warnings embedded in folklore that served as remembrance rather than mere entertainment. 200 warriors rising from depths would soon test whether kindness could survive contact with justice that served collective security over individual gratitude, ancient law over recent compassion, established protocol over emergency precedent that might encourage dangerous assumptions about oceanic tolerance for treaty violations. However, well-intentioned such contact might appear to surface dwellers whose understanding of oceanic politics remained dangerously incomplete. Chapter 3. Dawn's second arrival brought calm that felt deceptive after storm's violence. The sea stretching toward horizon with mirror smoothness that reflected morning sky without hint of disturbance beneath surface that concealed movements and preparations invisible to land-dwelling observation, despite their significance for immediate future of coastal peace that treaties had maintained there. A careful balance of mutual respect and systematic separation. Aaron stood on cliff overlooking harbor, where his boat waited for inspection of storm damage that might require repair before normal fishing routine could resume, though attention remained divided between practical concerns about equipment maintenance and persistent memory of encounter that had transformed understanding of reality through direct experience, with legends that coastal folklore had reserved as warning rather than invitation. Calm morning, he observed to wind, that carried no response beyond gentle movement of air that spoke of atmospheric pressure, returning to normal patterns after meteorological violence that had reshaped familiar landscape through deposit of debris and erosion of features that required careful navigation during routine activities. The sea stretched empty of visible life beyond normal birds whose fishing activities created ripples that marked their successful dives for prey, that storms typically dispersed beyond easy reach of surface feeders, whose hunting success depended upon stable weather conditions that recent violence had disrupted through turbulence affecting marine ecosystem. But beneath apparent tranquility, currents moved with purpose that challenged assumption about oceanic indifference to surface activities, while depths concealed gathering that would soon manifest through emergence of forces that human observation had never witnessed, despite warnings that folklore had embedded in coastal culture through stories that seemed increasingly prophetic rather than merely entertaining. The first sign emerged as distant disturbance on horizon, where water began behaving differently from surrounding calm, its movement suggesting organized activity beneath surface that natural phenomena could not explain, through normal patterns of current interaction or marine life behavior that experience had taught him to recognize and interpret correctly. What in the depths? Aaron murmured, while focusing attention upon anomaly that grew more pronounced as observation continued, its characteristics defying explanation through conventional understanding of oceanic dynamics, despite clear evidence that something significant was approaching from depths where human knowledge remained theoretical rather than practical. The disturbance resolved into formation that challenged every assumption about impossible versus inevitable, legendary versus historical, mythical versus immediate threat to peaceful existence that solitude had protected through isolation from political complications that community involvement typically created through collective responsibility for individual actions. Warriors emerged from depths with precision that spoke of military organization, beyond anything surface-dwelling communities could achieve through land-based training, their formation suggesting discipline and coordination that required extensive preparation for operation, whose purpose became apparent as numbers continued increasing beyond casual patrol toward demonstration of force that command the attention rather than merely maintaining routine security. 200, Iran counted with growing alarm, as emergence continued revealing scope of response that far exceeded anything emergency assistance should have motivated through normal oceanic law enforcement procedures. suggesting interpretation of events that transformed humanitarian aid into violation requiring significant intervention rather than simple diplomatic inquiry. The warriors possessed bearing that marked them as elite force, whose capabilities exceeded normal military service through selection and training, that prepared them for operations requiring exceptional skill and absolute loyalty to oceanic authority, that recognized no surface jurisdiction or appeal process when treaty violations demanded response through demonstration rather than negotiation. Their leader commanded attention through presence that distinguished command authority from operational support, his bearing suggesting experience and judgment that qualified him for decisions affecting relationship between realms, whose peace depended upon mutual respect for boundaries that unauthorized contact threatened through precedent, rather than immediate damage to established diplomatic fur. M-Work. Kale of the Tide March. The commander identified himself with voice that carried across water with clarity that defied distance, while his golden eyes focused upon Cottage, where Aaron stood with recognition that individual responsibility could not be avoided through claims of ignorance about consequences that humanitarian assistance had created. Surface Dweller. Kale continued with formal address that acknowledged Iran's existence while maintaining distance that protocol demanded between representative of oceanic authority and land-based individual whose actions had motivated official response through violation of contact restrictions regardless of intentions that inspired such behavior. You provided assistance to Princess Thalassa during unauthorized surface visit that endangered royal safety while violating treaty provisions established to maintain peaceful separation between our realms through mutual respect for established boundaries and appropriate limitations on interaction. Princess? Aaron repeated with shock that title revelation created through transformation of rescued individual from anonymous emergency victim into royal personage, whose welfare carried political significance exceeding anything humanitarian considerations alone could justify through simple life preservation motivated by compassion rather than diplomatic strategy. Princess Thalassa, heir to oceanic throne, whose safety represents paramount concern for realm security, given her importance for future governance and diplomatic stability, that succession planning requires through protective measures that surface contact compromised, despite beneficial outcomes that emergency assistance achieved. The explanation revealed complexity that simple rescue had never encompassed in Iran's understanding of events that had seemed straightforward when reduced to immediate choice between providing life-saving assistance or allowing suffering to continue through adherence to restrictions whose existence he had not fully comprehended despite folkloric warnings. "I didn't know," he said with honesty, that acknowledged ignorance about political implications, while maintaining conviction that emergency circumstances had justified assistance, regardless of diplomatic complications, that such aid might create through unintended violation of agreements he had never seen or formally accepted. Ignorance of treaty terms does not absolve surface dwellers of responsibility for actions that affect oceanic security, Kale replied, with tone that balanced understanding of circumstances with necessity of maintaining legal framework that protected both realms through clear consequences for boundary violations, regardless of motivations that inspired such contact. Though intentions and behavior during emergency contact will be evaluated as mitigating factors in determining appropriate response to violation that could have resulted in Princess's death, despite unauthorized nature of assistance that treaty provisions technically prohibit without explicit oceanic permission. So what happens now? Iran asked with recognition that his fate depended upon oceanic justice system that operated according to laws he did not understand, while circumstances had placed him beyond protection of surface authorities whose jurisdiction ended at water's edge where oceanic sovereignty began. Now we convene tribunal to evaluate circumstances of contact, assess compliance with emergency assistance provisions, and determine whether violation represents deliberate challenge to treaty authority or acceptable response to crisis situation that ancient agreements anticipated through recognition that humanitarian obligation transcends political convenience. The formal process offered hope that justice would consider circumstances alongside technical violations, though oceanic law remained mysterious to surface dweller whose experience with justice had never extended beyond human courts that operated according to principles he understood, despite occasional disagreement with outcomes that seemed to favor established authority over individual equity. "Will I be permitted to speak in my own defense?" he asked with awareness that alien justice system might not recognize rights that surface law considered fundamental for fair evaluation of circumstances that required understanding context alongside examining evidence of actual behavior during controversial incident. Defense presentations are an essential component of oceanic justice, Cale assured with respect for procedure that suggested systematic fairness despite cultural differences that might affect interpretation of evidence or evaluation of appropriate penalties for violations that challenged established diplomatic framework. Though tribunal composition will include oceanic authorities whose perspective on surface contact reflects centuries of experience with violations that claimed humanitarian justification, while serving less acceptable purposes that required enforcement action to maintain security through consistent application of treaty boundaries. As morning progressed toward formal proceedings that would determine consequences for compassionate choice that had seemed obvious when focused solely on preserving life, Iran found himself confronting legal framework that balanced individual conscience against collective security through processes designed to serve justice while protecting both communities from dangers that unregulated contact could create. Before tribunal convenes, Cale announced with decision that suggested authority to modify standard procedures when circumstances warranted consideration of factors that normal protocol might not address adequately. Princess Thalassa has requested opportunity to provide testimony regarding treatment received during emergency assistance. She wished to speak on my behalf? Iran asked with surprise that royal personage would involve herself in legal proceedings that could complicate her own position regarding unauthorized surface visit that had created crisis requiring official response through military intervention rather than simple diplomatic inquiry. Princess considers accurate testimony about surface contact essential for tribunal understanding of circumstances that brought oceanic air into contact with land dweller, whose actions determined whether emergency assistance would preserve royal life or allow preventable death through adherence to restrictions that emergency provisions were designed to override. The princess's support offered hope, while creating complexity that involved royal authority in proceedings that might affect diplomatic relationships between realms, whose peace depended upon consistent application of treaty terms, that individual exceptions could not override without careful evaluation of precedent. Such decisions might establish for future interactions. As morning advanced toward formal proceedings that would test whether justice could bridge difference between letter and spirit of law, ancient agreement and present circumstance, collective security and individual conscience, Aaron prepared to learn whether oceanic wisdom could recognize compassion as strength rather than weakness in world where mercy often faced opposition from those who confuse. Kindness with dangerous naivety. Several hours later, the tribunal assembled on neutral ground where tide pool created natural amphitheater that honored both oceanic presence and surface accessibility, its formation allowing equal dignity for participants whose different physical requirements typically prevented shared space despite need for mutual understanding that justice demanded through inclusive proceedings. Princess Thalassa emerged from depths with bearing that emphasized royal authority alongside personal investment in proceedings that would affect both immediate participant and broader relationships between communities, whose cooperation remained essential, despite ancient separations that fear had justified through experiences whose relevance to current circumstances required careful evaluation. Honored Tribunal, she began with formal address that acknowledged proceedings' significance, while her golden eyes conveyed gratitude toward surface dweller, whose assistance had preserved royal life, despite unauthorized nature of contact, that technical treaty violations made problematic regardless of beneficial outcomes. Emergency assistance provided by Iran Hale exceeded requirements of humanitarian obligation while respecting oceanic dignity through behavior that demonstrated understanding of appropriate boundaries, despite crisis circumstances that could have justified less careful attention to cultural sensitivity. Her testimony continued describing night of patient care that had addressed immediate crisis while creating atmosphere of mutual respect that challenged assumptions about surface dweller capacity for appropriate behavior when granted access to oceanic individual whose welfare depended upon understanding and cooperation, rather than exploitation of vulnerability. Surface contact remained focused entirely upon medical necessity without attempt to extract information, establish ongoing relationship, or violate privacy that royal status deserved, despite emergency circumstances that could have justified less respectful approach to assistance that saved royal life through competent intervention. The detailed account provided framework for evaluating violation that served preservation of oceanic air rather than challenging established authority, while demonstrating that surface dwellers' character qualified him for trust, despite cultural differences that normally prevented such intimate cooperation between representatives of realms whose separation served mutual protection. Furthermore, Princess Thalassa concluded with authority that royal position provided for influencing tribunal decisions. Circumstances of salt poisoning that required surface assistance resulted from my own violation of oceanic safety protocols rather than surface dweller action that endangered royal welfare through hostile or negligent behavior toward oceanic individual. The admission shifted responsibility toward royal judgment rather than surface dweller violation, while providing context that explained emergency circumstances that had made unauthorized contact necessary for preserving life that oceanic law valued above diplomatic convenience when genuine humanitarian crisis demanded intervention. Tribunal will consider testimony alongside evidence of actual behavior during emergency contact, Kale announced with formal closure that began deliberation process, where oceanic justice would evaluate whether compassionate assistance deserved recognition rather than punishment, despite technical violations that letter of treaty had prohibited without consideration for spirit of cooperation that circumstances had demanded. Looking toward Thalassa, whose presence at tribunal demonstrated royal support for surface dweller, whose kindness had transcended species barriers to preserve life through competent care that respected dignity while addressing emergency, Iran understood that encounter had achieved more than simple life preservation. It had created opportunity for relationship that challenged ancient assumptions out necessary separation between worlds, whose cooperation remained possible, despite cultural differences that careful respect could overcome. The tribunal's decision would determine whether mercy could serve as bridge between realms, or would face opposition from those who interpreted kindness as weakness in world, where strength often masked fear of change, that compassionate understanding might demand from communities whose isolation served comfort more than authentic security. 1 year later, the lighthouse that had stood dormant for 3 decades now cast its beam across waters, where new patterns of cooperation had replaced ancient suspicion, its restoration serving as symbol of partnership between surface and oceanic communities, whose shared investment in coastal safety represented transformation that few could have imagined when tribunal proceedings had concluded with unprecedented decision to establish formal diplomatic relations. Iran maintained the beacon with pride that encompassed both practical responsibility for maritime safety and recognition that his role as lighthouse keeper connected him to larger purpose. That individual compassion had ultimately inspired through consequences extending far beyond single night of emergency assistance that had challenged established boundaries between worlds. The keeper's quarters provided comfortable living space that replaced his storm-damaged cottage, while offering elevated perspective on harbor where fishing boats worked alongside oceanic scouts, whose cooperation had revolutionized marine conservation through shared knowledge about current patterns, seasonal migrations, and sustainable harvesting practices that benefited both communities. "Good morning, Aaron," Thalassa called from tidal platform that had been constructed to facilitate regular diplomatic meetings between surface and oceanic representatives, whose ongoing communication had become essential for managing cooperative initiatives that required constant coordination despite cultural differences that careful respect had learned to bridge. "Morning, Princess," he replied with warmth that had replaced initial formality through a year of friendship that had deepened beyond simple gratitude toward genuine affection, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to diplomatic success, that their unlikely encounter had made possible through demonstrated proof that understanding could overcome ancient prejudices. "Ambassador," she corrected with smile, that acknowledged his recent appointment to position that formalized role he had been performing informally since tribunal decision had established him as surface liaison, whose understanding of oceanic culture qualified him for representing land-dwelling interests in negotiations that required sensitivity to both communities' needs. "Still adjusting to title," he admitted with humor, that reflected ongoing amazement at transformation from solitary fisherman to diplomatic representative whose responsibilities included facilitating cooperation that was reshaping relationships between realms whose separation had seemed permanent until emergency circumstances had demonstrated possibilities for mutually beneficial collaboration. "Any word from Northern Territories regarding trade agreement negotiations?" Thalassa asked with reference to expanded diplomatic initiative that had grown from local cooperation to regional framework, where multiple coastal communities had requested guidance for establishing their own oceanic partnerships based on successful model that their experience had developed. Council approved preliminary terms yesterday, Aaron reported with satisfaction, that encompassed both specific achievement and broader recognition that diplomatic approach was gaining acceptance among surface authorities whose initial skepticism had gradually transformed into enthusiasm for economic opportunities that oceanic cooperation provided. Outstanding, she responded with equal pleasure at progress that had required patience and persistent demonstration of mutual benefits that overcame resistance from conservative factions within both communities, whose fears about change had gradually yielded to evidence that cooperation served everyone's welfare better than isolation. Though implementation will require careful attention to cultural protocols that northern communities haven't had opportunity to develop through direct experience with oceanic customs and appropriate behavior during formal interactions, he noted with awareness that success depended upon education alongside economic incentives. Which is why Maritime Academy curriculum includes comprehensive instruction about cross-cultural communication that prepares surface dwellers for respectful engagement with oceanic representatives, while providing oceanic students with understanding of surface social dynamics that facilitates productive diplomatic relationships, she replied, with reference to educational initiative that had become a cornerstone of expanded cooperation. The Academy represented perhaps their greatest achievement through joint development of institution that trained diplomats, translators, marine biologists, and cultural specialists whose expertise would sustain cooperation through generations of professionals who understood both communities' perspectives, while possessing skills necessary for bridging differences that respectful communication could overcome. Speaking of education, Aaron said with transition toward personal topic that had been developing through months of increasingly frequent interaction that extended beyond official diplomatic meetings toward friendship, that both treasured, despite political complexities that royal status and surface liaison responsibilities created for personal relationships. Yes? Thalassa encouraged with attention that suggested awareness of significance behind casual introduction to subject that had been approaching discussion through gradual building of trust and mutual understanding that transcended professional cooperation toward recognition of emotional connection that circumstances had fostered. I've been wondering about possibility of cultural exchange program that would allow surface individuals to experience oceanic environment through extended visits that provide immersive education about underwater civilization and social organization that theoretical study alone cannot adequately convey. Interesting proposal, she replied with thoughtful consideration that acknowledged both educational value and personal implications of suggestion that might provide framework for closer relationship while serving legitimate diplomatic purpose through enhanced understanding between communities whose cooperation benefited from informed appreciation of each other's achievements and challenges. Such program would require development of life support systems that allow surface dwellers to survive underwater environment for extended periods, while maintaining physical comfort that enables focused learning rather than constant struggle with environmental adaptation, she observed with practical focus on technical requirements that implementation would demand. Though oceanic magic could provide solutions for atmospheric needs, while protective barriers address pressure differences that normally prevent surface dweller access to depths where oceanic civilization demonstrates its highest achievements through architectural and artistic accomplishments that surface visitors would find remarkable. And would oceanic authorities approve surface dweller presence in secured areas where such educational programs would necessarily take place? Aaron asked with awareness that security concerns might override educational benefits, despite demonstrated trustworthiness that year of cooperation had established through consistent appropriate behavior. Approval would require careful evaluation of participants whose character and motivations qualify them for access to oceanic society, Thalassa replied, with meaningful glance that suggested his own candidacy for such program, while acknowledging that individual merit rather than political position would determine eligibility for cultural immersion that represented significant privilege. Though certain individuals whose demonstrated respect for oceanic customs and proven commitment to diplomatic cooperation might receive special consideration for pilot program that establishes protocols and safety measures for expanded cultural exchange initiatives. As conversation continued, exploring possibilities for deeper cooperation that extended beyond political agreements toward personal relationships that enriched both their lives through friendship, that challenged species barriers without violating cultural obligations that royal status and diplomatic responsibilities required them to maintain. Afternoon brought arrival of messenger whose presence suggested significant development in ongoing negotiations. Ambassador Iran, Princess Thalassa, Captain Aldrich announced with formal courtesy that indicated official communication requiring immediate attention, despite interruption of personal time that both valued for relaxation from constant diplomatic pressures that successful cooperation demanded through systematic attention to countless details. News from Central Maritime Authority regarding comprehensive oceanic treaty proposal that would establish binding framework for continental cooperation between surface and oceanic communities through standardized protocols that expand local success to regional implementation. He explained with significance that encompassed transformation of experimental cooperation into established diplomatic reality. Treaty approval would create permanent institutional structure for managing relationships that individual agreements cannot sustain across diverse communities, whose specific needs require flexible adaptation of general principles, while maintaining consistent respect for sovereignty and cultural autonomy. Princess Thalassa observed with recognition that success had achieved scope that required a formalization through legal framework, and would establish Lighthouse Diplomatic Station as headquarters for Continental Oceanic Relations Office, whose responsibilities would include training, mediation, protocol development, and crisis response that expanded cooperation demands through systematic management of complex relationships, Iran added, with understanding that their work had created foundation for permanent institution. Furthermore, Captain Aldrich continued with announcement that would affect both their personal and professional futures. Treaty specifically recommends appointment of current partnership team as permanent co-directors of Oceanic Relations Office, given proven effectiveness of cooperative approach that has achieved unprecedented success in establishing peaceful and profitable relationships between and previously separated communities. The formal recognition represented validation of years' work, while creating opportunity for continued partnership that would serve both personal satisfaction and broader diplomatic purpose through institutionalization of relationship that had begun with simple compassion during emergency circumstances that had ultimately transformed understanding between worlds. Looking toward Thalassa, whose golden eyes reflected both professional satisfaction and personal happiness at prospect of continued cooperation that would preserve friendship, while expanding their influence to serve broader purpose, that initial encounter had ultimately inspired through consequences exceeding anything either could have anticipated. Iran understood that single night of storm-driven compassion had achieved transformation that would affect countless lives through diplomatic revolution, sparked by willingness to provide fresh water to dying Mermaid. The fisherman who had given water to save life had discovered that mercy could indeed serve as bridge between worlds, while Princess, who had received assistance, had proven that gratitude could overcome ancient fears when supported by wisdom that chose cooperation over convenient separation that served neither community effectively in world where shared challenges required shared solutions. Their partnership would continue serving both personal fulfillment and broader purpose through diplomatic work that honored both surface and oceanic sovereignty, while demonstrating that differences could strengthen rather than weaken relationships when approached with respect, patience, and recognition, that understanding transcended species barriers to embrace common values that connected all conscious beings who chose compassion over convenience when circumstances demanded courage to bridge differences that seemed insurmountable until challenged by love. The 200 sea warriors who had surrounded beach with intention to enforce ancient boundaries had ultimately become witnesses to transformation that proved mercy could triumph over tradition when supported by wisdom that chose growth over comfortable stagnation, while Lighthouse that now guided both surface vessels and oceanic travelers served as symbol of cooperation that honored both realms, while protecting all who traveled waters, where understanding had replaced hostility through patient work of building trust that would endure across generations of continued partnership. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.